The docking clamps fired without permission. That was the first thing the station's automated defense grid registered. An unauthorized vessel, bearing no recognized transponder signal, no alliance markings, no pre-cleared arrival code, pressing its hull against Bay 14 of the Conclave orbital, as if it had been doing so for 100 years. The bay doors did not open. The clamps fired anyway. The ship's pilot had simply overridden the lock sequence from outside, using a frequency the Conclave had retired 40 years ago, and assumed no living species still knew. The species that knew it had been listening for a very long time. My name is Cale Morrow. I was 41 years old when I walked through those bay doors, wearing a charcoal suit that had been pressed 3 times during the 16-day journey, carrying a leather satchel that held the only copy of something I had spent 2 years building. The air in the docking corridor was cold and carried a faint chemical smell, something between old metal and something alive that I could not name. My boots made a sound on the floor that I had not expected, a low, resonant echo, as though the corridor itself was hollow in ways that had nothing to do with engineering. I was not supposed to be there. Earth had not been invited. The Galactic Conclave, a governing body representing 47 spacefaring civilizations stretching across 11 star systems, had never sent us a message, never acknowledged our probes, never so much as returned a frequency ping in the 4 years since we achieved faster-than-light travel. We had knocked politely, repeatedly, through official channels that we had spent considerable effort identifying. Nothing came back. So we stopped knocking. The coordinates for the Conclave orbital had taken 14 months to locate. Our signals intelligence teams had been working around the clock, mapping transmission bursts, triangulating origin points, filtering out the noise of a galaxy that does not particularly care if you are listening. When the coordinates finally resolved into something real, into an actual set of numbers that corresponded to an actual point in space, the debate back home lasted exactly 6 days before the Prime Council voted to send someone. They sent me. I had been Earth's lead diplomatic analyst for 11 years, which meant I had spent 11 years reading every piece of intercepted alien communication we had managed to collect, cataloging behavioral patterns, mapping hierarchies, building models of how these civilizations thought, what they valued, what they feared. I knew the Conclave existed before most governments on Earth did. I had argued for contact for 3 years running, in reports that were marked classified and filed in rooms where people argued about the risk of revealing ourselves too early. Nobody argues about that anymore. The corridor ended at a set of blast doors that were sealed. I pressed my palm to the control surface beside them. Nothing happened. I took a small device from my jacket pocket, a signal emitter no larger than a thumb, and held it near the seam of the doors. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, and then the doors opened. On the other side was a room the size of a cathedral. I had studied images of the conclave chamber from the fragments of visual data we had intercepted over the years, but images had not prepared me for the scale of it, or for the silence. The chamber was arranged in concentric rings of seated positions, each ring elevated slightly above the one before it, so that the entire space faced inward toward a central floor that was currently empty. The seats were filled with beings I recognized from years of study and beings I had never seen before. Some were tall, some were broad, some had coloring that my eyes struggled to categorize. Several appeared to be breathing a supplemental atmosphere through apparatus fitted around their faces. Every single one of them was looking at me. The silence lasted long enough that I was able to walk from the blast doors to the center of the chamber floor without anyone saying a word. My footsteps were the only sound in a room containing several hundred representatives of 47 civilizations. There was, in the innermost ring directly facing the center floor, one empty seat. It was positioned slightly apart from the others, framed on either side by representatives whose GSPs I recognized as among the conclave's oldest members. The seat itself was different from the others, older looking, made of a dark material that did not quite match the smooth surfaces around it. There was no nameplate. There was no designation visible to me. I would learn later that the seat was called the absent chair, held empty in ceremonial acknowledgement of the Ravani, a civilization that had gone silent 800 years ago and had never been declared extinct, only absent. No one had ever sat in it during a formal session. I sat in it. The silence cracked, not loudly, not in anger. It cracked the way ice cracks when weight is placed on it unexpectedly. A sharp sound followed by a spreading pattern of smaller sounds, murmurs moving through the rings like a wave. I set my satchel on the floor beside my feet, folded my hands in my lap and waited. The being who spoke first was seated at the apex of the innermost ring, directly opposite me. I knew who it was. Archdelegate Vorath of the Vithara, the oldest continuously serving member of the Conclave's governing council, a figure whose communications I had spent years analyzing. The Vithara were the dominant power in this body. They had been for 3 centuries. Vorath had held this position for 40 years, which for a veteran was not especially long, but which meant he had outlasted 7 of Earth's most recent political administrations. He spoke in the Conclave's common trade language, which I had been studying for 2 years, and could follow at roughly 80% comprehension. He said, in essence, that my presence was unauthorized, that the seat I occupied was not mine to occupy, that I had entered the station by means that violated 17 separate protocols, and that the conclave would need to determine what response was appropriate before any dialogue could take place. I let him finish, then I reached into my satchel and took out a small data core matte gray, about the size of a closed fist. I set it on the floor in the center of the chamber, directly under the light. I said, in the same trade language, that I understood all of that, and that I appreciated the clarity. I said that Earth had attempted contact through standard channels for 4 years without response, that we had therefore concluded the standard channels did not work for us, and that we had taken the initiative to make direct contact instead. I said that the data core on the floor contained a full accounting of human civilization, beginning approximately 10,000 years ago. Every conflict, every disaster, every period of collapse and recovery, every scientific breakthrough, every moment when we had come to the edge of ending ourselves and chosen, or stumbled, or been dragged back from it. I said that if the conclave wanted to know who we were and whether we belonged at that table, the answer was in the core, and they were welcome to examine it at their convenience. Then I said, because I had been rehearsing it for 16 days on the ship, and because the moment felt exactly right, I understand this is unusual. I understand that no one asked us to come. But with respect, no one asked the Vithara to expand into the Cyril Reach 400 years ago either, and you have a seat here. The room went very quiet again. Vorath looked at me for a long moment. His expression was not something I could read with complete confidence, but the stillness of it suggested that he was recalibrating something. When he spoke again, his tone had changed in a way I noted carefully. He asked what a young species, one that had possessed faster-than-light travel for 11 years, could possibly offer a body that had been governing interstellar affairs for 3 centuries. I looked at him. I looked around the room, at all of those faces, those forms, those beings who had been navigating this galaxy, long before any human being had looked up at the night sky and wondered what the lights were. I said, ask me that again in 10 years. Nobody asked me to leave. That was the first answer I needed. I stayed in my seat for the remainder of that session, which lasted 4 more hours. I did not speak again. I listened to everything. My comprehension improved to approximately 90% by the time the session ended, partly because focus sharpens the mind in ways that study cannot fully replicate, and partly because I had been waiting my whole professional life for this moment, and I was not going to waste a single word of it. When the session ended and the chamber began to empty, a small being, gray-skinned, roughly the height of a 10-year-old child, approached me with a movement that I interpreted as deliberate and non-threatening. It handed me a flat token, copper-colored, and said something I did not fully catch. I caught the word for quarters and the word for temporary. I nodded and followed when it gestured. My room on the conclave orbital was small and smelled of the same unidentifiable living metal air as the corridor. The bed was not designed for human proportions. I did not sleep well. I did not care. Outside the small viewport, the stars were exactly where they had always been. We had simply moved closer to them. The morning after I sat in the absent chair, 3 different delegations requested meetings with me before I had finished the compressed food pack I had brought from the ship. By the end of the first week, I had spoken with 11 of the 47 member civilizations. 9 of those conversations were cautious, probing, built on layers of careful phrasing that I recognized as the diplomatic equivalent of checking whether the ground was solid before putting weight on it. 2 of the conversations were different. The first was with a delegate named Orisso, representing a small civilization called the Thelani, whose home system was located in a region of space that the Vithara had been slowly encircling for 60 years through a combination of trade agreements and military positioning that technically violated none of the conclave's formal treaties while very clearly accomplishing the same result. Orissa was older than she looked, which, I learned later, was common for her species, and she spoke the trade language with a precision that told me she had been practicing for this conversation for longer than a day. She asked me, directly and without preamble, whether Earth intended to petition for full membership or simply observer status. I told her full membership was Earth's intention. She nodded slowly, and then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that there had been 17 species in the last 2 centuries that had arrived at the conclave seeking membership. Of those 17, 11 had eventually been voted in. 3 had withdrawn their petitions after pressure from certain member states had made the cost of membership too high to manage. 3 had not been heard from again. She let that sit for a moment. Then she asked if I understood what she was telling me. I said that I did. She nodded again, and something in her posture changed, became less formal, and she said that the Thelani had been watching Earth for 6 years, longer than we had been watching ourselves in this context, and that they had reached a conclusion that she was prepared to share with me, off the record, as something between a warning and an offer. The conclusion was this: humanity was not like the other 17. The second different conversation was with someone who would become important later, but whose name I will hold until the time is right. That conversation lasted 40 minutes and ended with a handshake that confused my counterpart deeply, because the gesture apparently had no equivalent in their culture, but they returned it anyway, which I took as a good sign. Earth had a seat at the table. What happened next would determine whether we deserved it. The session's vote was scheduled for a Tuesday. I know that is an odd detail to lead with, that I measured the most significant political attack on Earth's future by the day of the week. But when you have been living on a space station for 6 months, far from any planet with a proper sunrise, you start holding on to the small anchors of your old life very tightly. Tuesday meant the vote was coming. It meant I had run out of time. The motion had been introduced by the Vethara 11 days earlier, framed as a routine matter of interstellar commerce regulation. The language was careful, almost gentle. It proposed a temporary suspension of trade licensing for all non-member civilizations, within a defined corridor of space that happened to include every viable trade route between Earth's system and the nearest 3 inhabited systems we had begun developing commercial relationships with. Temporary was a word that appeared 4 times in the motion's text. Suspension appeared twice. Licensing appeared 6 times. Earth appeared nowhere, which was the point. If Earth appeared, it would look like what it was. Instead, it looked like paperwork. I had identified the motion for what it was within 2 hours of it being circulated. By the end of that first day, I had mapped the expected vote: 26 in favor, 17 against, 4 abstentions. The math was straightforward. The Vethara had enough allied votes to pass it cleanly. If it passed, Earth's commercial development would be strangled quietly over the following 18 months. And by the time the damage was visible enough to protest formally, the situation would have calcified into something that was very difficult to reverse. I had 11 days to change 26 votes to 18, or move 4 abstentions to opposition, or find some other combination that added up to failure for the motion. I had no money, no staff, no fleet, and no political history in this body. I had my 2 legs, my leather satchel, my language skills, and 10,000 years of human experience to draw from. I started with the people no one else talked to. The conclave's smallest member delegations occupied a section of the station that was, in a very literal sense, less well-maintained than the rest of it. The corridors there were narrower. The ambient temperature was slightly lower. The signage was less current. It was not something that any official document acknowledged. It was simply the accumulated expression of where resources went and where they did not, over a very long period of time, in an institution whose dominant power had been the same for 3 centuries. I had spent 2 nights reading everything I could find about each of the smallest delegations, their histories, their grievances, their relationships with the Vethara, their relationships with each other. Most of them had stories that rhymed with each other. They had joined the conclave at different times, under different circumstances, and most of them had arrived with genuine hope that membership would mean something. Over the decades, that hope had been replaced by something more practical. They knew the shape of the institution they were in. They voted with the dominant bloc on the things that mattered to the dominant bloc. In exchange, they were left alone on the things that mattered to them, as long as what mattered to them remained small enough to be tolerated. It was a very old arrangement. I recognized it immediately. The first delegate I approached directly was a being named Seth. representing a civilization called the Marasi, whose home planet had been experiencing a slow environmental deterioration for decades. The Marasi had been petitioning the conclave for technology sharing assistance for 12 years. The petition had been tabled repeatedly. Not rejected, tabled. There is a difference. Rejection can be appealed. Tabling is simply the indefinite postponement of a decision, which requires no justification and produces no record. I sat with Seth in a small common area near the delegation's quarters, and I did not open with policy. I asked about the Marasi's home system. I asked about the specific nature of the environmental problem they were facing. I asked questions that made it clear I had read their petition documents thoroughly and had formed genuine opinions about the proposed solutions. Seth was quiet for a long time after that. Not suspicious. Something more careful than suspicion, more considered. Finally, she asked what I wanted. I told her the truth. I told her that the trade sanctions motion would pass in 11 days, that it would not directly harm the Marasi, because the Marasi were not in the affected corridor, but that it would set a precedent for using commercial regulation as a weapon against a specific civilization without naming that civilization explicitly. I asked her to think about what that precedent might eventually mean for a civilization whose environmental petition had been tabled 12 times. She was quiet again for a different length of time. I met with 7 more delegates in the following 3 days. Each meeting was different because each civilization was different, and I had learned enough by that point to know that the worst thing you can do in diplomacy is treat every counterpart as a variation on the same type. The Vithara made that mistake constantly. They had a taxonomy of species that they applied like a sorting algorithm, and it made them efficient, and it made them wrong in ways they rarely recognized. I did not have the luxury of efficiency. I had to be correct. By day 5, I had moved 2 votes, not to active opposition, to uncertainty, which in political terms is its own kind of movement. Delegates who are uncertain ask questions. Delegates who ask questions create delay. Delay creates space for other things to happen. On day 6, something else happened. A delegate named Paris, representing a mid-tier civilization called the Sundari that I had assessed as firmly aligned with the Vethara, requested a private meeting with me. This was unusual. I had not approached the Sundari directly. They were not among my targets because I had assessed them as unreachable within the time frame. When Paris arrived at the meeting location, I had suggested a small observation lounge on the station's outer ring. She looked like someone who had recently made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with. She sat down. She said, without any diplomatic preamble, that she had heard I was speaking with the smaller delegations. She said that the Sundari were aware of what the trade sanctions motion was actually intended to accomplish. She said that the Sundari had voted with the Vethara on 14 of the last 16 major motions, and that she would not tell me why, but she wanted me to understand that the Sundari were not without their own views on how the conclave should function. Then, she said something I wrote down verbatim that evening, because I did not want to misremember it. You are new enough not to know what it costs to vote differently. I am telling you that so that you understand the value of what I am about to offer. She abstained. On record, formally, she submitted an abstention before the session began, which in conclave procedure had the same effect as a negative vote when the margin was close enough. We were at -1 with 5 days to go. On day 8, I had a crisis. It was not a political crisis. It was a personal one, which is perhaps worse when you are the only representative of your species on a station full of beings who are watching you closely for signs of weakness. I woke up in the middle of what passed for night on the station, and I sat on the edge of the too-short bed, and I thought about how far from home I was and how the decision I was trying to prevent would affect 11 billion people who did not know my name, and how the only leverage I actually had was the fact that I had read a great deal and asked careful questions. I sat there for about 20 minutes. Then I got up, made the approximation of coffee that my food supplies allowed, and opened my files. I went back to something I had been avoiding because it made the situation feel larger than I could manage. I went back to human history, not the sanitized version, the full record, the one I had loaded onto the data core that still sat in the center of the conclave chamber. I read about the reconstruction of Europe after a catastrophic conflict in the middle of the last century, a program that transferred resources across borders to rebuild nations that had very recently been enemies. Mutual investment in stability, not out of pure generosity, but out of the recognition that poverty and desperation in a neighbor's house eventually becomes instability in your own. I thought about the 17 petitions I had been working on. I thought about the Marasis environmental program, about two other civilizations whose infrastructure needs had been tabled for years, about a fourth whose trade corridor restrictions had been grandfathered into conclave policy so long ago that most current delegates did not know they existed. I picked up my communicator and started drafting. What I drafted was not a counter-motion. It was an offer, informal, off the record, delivered personally to 6 delegations over the following 2 days. The offer was simple. Earth would formally co-sponsor a request to revisit 3 long-standing tabled petitions and 1 grandfathered trade restriction, contingent on those delegations reviewing their position on the current trade sanctions motion before the vote. I want to be clear about something. I did not promise anything Earth had not already discussed and agreed to. The Prime Council had given me a considerable amount of latitude in how I conducted diplomatic outreach, and I had been in communication with them throughout, using encrypted channels that added about 18 hours to any exchange because of the transmission delay. Every commitment I made had been reviewed and approved. I was not improvising Earth's foreign policy from a small room on an alien space station, although it did feel like that at certain moments. The day before the vote, I had a conversation with Vorath. He found me. I had not requested a meeting, and when one of his staff members delivered a message indicating that the archdelegate would see me in his private office suite, I recognized what it was: an assessment. He wanted to look at me directly, at closer range, and determine what I was. His office was large and ordered in a way that told me a great deal about how he thought. The objects in the room were arranged by function and by hierarchy. Everything had a place, and the places formed a system. He had been in this office for 40 years and the room looked like it. He did not offer me a seat. I stood, which I had expected. He told me that he found my efforts over the past 10 days to be a demonstration of something he had not anticipated from a representative of a species with 11 years of interstellar experience. He said it in a way that sounded like a compliment and was not quite one. He said that humanity appeared to have a particular facility for what he described as lateral engagement, meaning the practice of building connections across the conclave's usual alignment structures. So I said that humans had considerable practice with that kind of engagement. I said that we had spent several centuries on our own planet developing economic and political systems, making a great many mistakes, and occasionally learning from them. He asked me what I thought I was accomplishing. Not with this vote specifically. He asked the larger question. He asked what Earth believed it was doing in this body. I thought carefully before answering, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to choose the right version of it. I said that Earth was not here to challenge the existing order. I said that was a very easy misreading of our presence, and I understood why it was attractive. I said that what we were actually here to do was participate honestly in an institution that we believed, based on everything we had observed, had the potential to be better than it currently was. Not because its members were bad, but because the structure it had developed rewarded a particular kind of behavior and did not reward others, and that over a long enough period of time, institutions reflect the behavior they reward. Vorath looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You are describing a change in how this body functions," I said. "I am describing a change in what it values." He asked me to leave, not angrily, formally. The meeting was over. The vote happened the following morning. I sat in my chair, the absent chair that had become, through 6 months of daily use, simply my chair, and I watched the tallies come in. The motion required a simple majority of 30 to pass. It received 24 votes in favor. 20 delegations voted against. 3 abstained. The motion failed. The room was not loud. The conclave was not a body that expressed itself loudly. But there was a change in the air that I could feel from where I was sitting. A shift in something. Like the moment in a room when the weight of a conversation has moved from one person to another. I looked at Vorath across the chamber. He was watching the tally display with an expression that had no emotion in it that I could identify. After a moment, he turned and looked at me. I did not smile. That would have been the wrong choice. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then looked away first, which was also a deliberate choice, because winning a political confrontation and performing your victory are 2 entirely different actions with 2 entirely different consequences. That evening, in my small room with the 2-short bed, I sent a message home. It was 42 words. It said the vote had failed, that we still had our seat, that the work had only just started, and that I needed 3 more analysts, 2 more translators, and a resupply of the compressed food packets because the station's available food options were manageable but not indefinitely so. The Prime Council responded in 18 hours with approval for the analysts and translators, a note of congratulations that was appropriately restrained, and a question about whether the compressed food situation was something I genuinely needed addressed, or whether I was using it as a light touch to end a serious communication. I replied that it was both. That night I sat at the viewport for a long time. The stars were different from this position in space than they were from Earth. Different arrangement, different brightness. But they were still stars, still the same quiet fire that human beings had been looking at for as long as there had been human beings. The Vethera had noticed us, not as a curiosity, and not as a nuisance. They had noticed us as something that required a different kind of attention. I had been in their institution for 6 months, and I had already changed a vote that was supposed to be settled before I arrived. I thought about what Seth had said to me after the vote, when she passed me in the corridor, and paused long enough to speak 2 sentences. She said that she had not voted against the motion because of any promise, and she wanted me to be clear on that. She had voted against it because, in 12 years of bringing her people's petition to this body, no one had ever asked her about her home planet. I thought about that for a long time. I am still thinking about it. Nobody warned me about the sound. In every simulation we had run back home, in every tactical model and engagement scenario our strategists had developed from intercepted data, the one thing none of them had captured accurately was the sound of a Drachnori rail strike on a ship hull. It is not an explosion, not in the way that word suggests. It is a compression wave that travels through the entire vessel simultaneously, as if the ship has taken a single enormous breath it cannot release. Everything on board vibrates for approximately 2 seconds. The lighting stutters. The pressure in your ears changes. And then it stops. And the silence after it is somehow louder than the impact. I am Commander Yara Osei, and I have heard that sound 9 times in the last 40 minutes. The 9th time, it took out our starboard sensor array and 3/4 of our secondary propulsion grid. We were running on primary drives and 3 functioning weapons platforms, holding position at the far edge of the Hollow Reach asteroid belt, and there were 41 Drachnori warships between us and the colony we were here to protect. We had 11. I want to be precise about how we arrived at this situation, because the number 11 sounds like someone in planning made a very serious error, and the truth is more complicated and also more important. Earth's fleet at this point in our interstellar history was not built for sustained large-scale engagement with a battle-hardened alien military. We had been in space for 17 years, faster than light capable for 6 of those, and our warship construction program had been running for 4. We had designed our vessels around the intelligence profiles we had built from intercepted data. Fast, modular, built for electronic disruption and precise strike capability, rather than the kind of sustained hammering engagement that older interstellar civilizations had developed over centuries of warfare with each other. What that meant in practical terms was that we were significantly outgunned in a straight exchange and significantly more capable in almost every other dimension. The Drachnori did not know the second part yet. The colony they had targeted was called Waypoint Nera, a settlement of roughly 4,000 people on a rock that was technically in unclaimed space but that had been human-occupied for 2 years, and that the Drachnori had decided, for reasons that would become clear later, needed to be removed. They had not announced this intention. They had simply arrived, in force, with a fleet configured for planetary suppression. We had arrived 6 hours before them. That was the one thing our intelligence had gotten right. My first officer was a man named Dale Farrow, who had been with me since my second posting and who had the useful quality of being absolutely calm in situations that were not calm at all. He was standing at the tactical display when the 9th strike hit, and when the vibration stopped, he said, in the same tone he used to request coffee, that the starboard array was gone and we needed a new approach to the sensor picture. I told him to link us into the passive array on the colony's surface. It was not designed for combat telemetry, but it would give us basic positional data on the Drachnori formation, which was currently holding at approximately 30,000 kilometers and had not yet pushed forward. That pause was interesting. It suggested they were waiting for something or assessing something, and I wanted to know what. What they were assessing, we would determine later, was our apparent willingness to stay. The Conclave's established military doctrine, which the Drachnori knew well because they had been raiding the fringes of Conclave space for decades, was built around a concept that translated roughly as proportional response. If you outgunned a defending force by a ratio of 4 to 1 or greater, The defending force was expected, by convention and by practical logic, to withdraw and request reinforcement. This was not cowardice in their framework. It was rational allocation of resources. Nobody threw 11 ships at 41 and held the field. Nobody in this galaxy had done that in living memory, and possibly longer. The Draknori were waiting for us to leave. "Tell me about the belt," I said to Pharaoh. He pulled up the mapping data. The Hollow Reach asteroid belt was what its name suggested. A dense field of irregular objects, ranging from small rocks to bodies the size of a large city, orbiting in a slow, chaotic pattern that had been partially mapped by the colony's survey teams over the previous 18 months. Partially mapped was the key phrase. The survey teams had mapped what they needed for navigation purposes, meaning the main transit corridors, the large bodies, the predictable clusters. What they had not mapped thoroughly was the interior, the regions that had no navigational value because no sane pilot would take a ship through them. "How deep does the survey data go?" I asked. "About 40% of the belt by volume," Pharaoh said. "Less in the interior zones. So 60% of that belt is unknown to anyone sitting at that Draknori formation." "Unknown to their data, yes. Our survey data is the same as the colonies. But we've had it for 2 weeks longer than they have," I said, "and we've been inside the belt for 6 hours." He looked at me, not with doubt, with the particular look he reserved for moments when he wanted to make sure he was understanding what I was suggesting, before he committed to helping me execute it. I explained the plan in 4 minutes. It was not a complex plan. Complexity in a situation like this one is a liability, because complex plans require things to go correctly in sequence, and nothing in combat goes correctly in sequence. The plan was built entirely around 2 things. One thing the Draknori knew, and one thing they did not. The thing they knew was that our 11 ships were damaged, outgunned, and had limited options. The thing they did not know was the interior geometry of the Hollow Reach asteroid belt at the level of detail our 6 hours of in-field navigation had given us. I split the fleet. 4 ships, including the 2 that had taken the least damage, went deep into the belt interior through a passage that our navigation teams had been threading carefully for the past 3 hours. They went dark. Minimum emissions, passive sensors only, moving slowly through a region that a Draknori navigational system would classify as effectively impassable for vessels of their configuration. Their ships were larger than ours. That had always been true of alien warships relative to our designs, and we had built for it. The remaining 7 ships, including my own, the ESV Endurance, positioned ourselves at the belt's near edge in a formation that looked, to an external observer, like a damaged fleet preparing to hold a defensive line, which is what it looked like because it partially is true. We were damaged, and we were holding a line. But the line was not the one the Draknori were watching. They pushed forward 40 minutes later, not cautiously. The Draknori did not do cautious. They came in a wedge formation, 41 ships moving at aggressive speed, targeting solutions already locked on our 7-ship line. The rail strikes came almost immediately, continuous this time, not probing. They had made their decision. We were going to be removed from the field, and the colony was going to be accessible within the hour. I let them commit to the push for 6 minutes. 6 minutes of taking fire, of absorbing damage across 7 ships, while our damage control teams worked and Pharaoh kept me updated on hull integrity, in a voice that remained completely level throughout. In 6 minutes, they closed from 30,000 kilometers to 11,000. At 11,000 kilometers, the 4 ships in the belt interior emerged. They came out of 3 different vectors simultaneously, from positions the Draknori formation had not been covering because the interior of that section of the belt was rated as non-navigable by their charts. They were behind the Draknori wedge's left flank, behind the right flank, and directly above the formation's rear anchor. The engagement window was approximately 90 seconds before the Draknori could rotate their formation to address the new threat vectors. We used 83 of those seconds. I want to be clear about what we were targeting. We were not targeting power systems or life support or propulsion in ways intended to destroy those ships. Every weapons platform on all 11 of our vessels was running a targeting protocol that our engineering teams had spent the previous 6 hours calculating. A protocol designed to disable navigation, communications, and weapons coordination across the maximum number of Draknori vessels in the minimum amount of time. We were not trying to wreck 41 ships. We were trying to create a situation in which 41 ships could not operate as a coordinated formation. At second 83, 14 Draknori vessels had lost navigational coordination, 7 had lost external communications, 3 had lost primary weapons power. The wedge formation had broken into separate clusters of ships that were still functional, but could no longer share targeting solutions or receive coordinated orders from the fleet command vessel. The Draknori commander was good. I will give him that without reservation. He recognized what had happened faster than I had projected, and his response, attempting to pull his formation back to a regrouping distance, was tactically sound. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. The problem was that his formation's flanks were inside the belt's navigation hazard zone, and pulling back at speed in that environment required a level of navigational precision that ships running on degraded coordination systems could not maintain. 6 Draknori vessels suffered collision damage in the regrouping movement. None were destroyed. 3 were immobilized. At minute 11, the Draknori fleet command vessel transmitted a request for cessation of engagement. I looked at Pharaoh. He looked at me. Standard acknowledgement, I said. Full stop. All platforms to stand down configuration. We stopped firing. They stopped firing. The hollow reach went quiet except for the slow drift of asteroids and the sound of our damage control teams working through the ship. I drafted the response to the cessation request myself, which was not standard procedure for a response of this nature. Normally, it would go through the fleet communications officer. But I had very specific ideas about what the response needed to say, and I needed to be the one who chose every word. The response said that the ESV Endurance and its accompanying fleet acknowledged the cessation request and agreed to full suspension of offensive action. It said that the human fleet had no territorial interest in Waypoint Nera beyond the safety of its civilian population, which remained entirely unharmed. It said that we recognized the Draknori fleet as a capable and organized military force that had engaged in this action under orders we had not yet been given the context for, and that we were open to understanding that context. It said that the 4,000 civilians on Waypoint Nera's surface were not combatants and were not relevant to any dispute that might exist between our respective governments or militaries, and that their status as civilians would be respected by our fleet regardless of how this situation developed. It said that we were prepared to discuss terms, that we required no demonstration of capitulation, and that we would wait. Pharaoh read it when I was done. He said, "That is not how the Draknori end engagements." I said, "I know. That is why I wrote it that way." The response from the Draknori command vessel took 9 minutes. When it came, it was short, direct, and, if I was reading the linguistic structure correctly, surprised. It requested clarification on one specific point. What did we want in exchange for withdrawal? I said. A conversation. They did not know what to do with that. The communications log that came back to us over the following months, obtained through intelligence channels, showed that the Draknori fleet commander had consulted with his senior staff for 22 minutes before responding, and that the consultation had been dominated by a single question. What did a conversation mean as a military demand? Nobody had an answer. What happened in the following weeks, as Draknori and human military representatives met through intermediaries, and then directly, belongs to a different part of this story. What matters now is what happened on the conclave stations when reports of the engagement reached the galactic body 3 days after the battle, as signals travel at rates that even faster than light civilizations find humbling when the distances are large enough. Kale told me later, in a message I received 6 weeks after the hollow reach, what it had been like in the chamber when the report was presented. He said the room had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet he had experienced on his first day, when he walked in and took the empty seat. He said that the first day's quiet was the quiet of a body that did not know what to make of something unexpected. The quiet when the hollow reach report was read aloud was the quiet of a room full of beings who were rapidly and uncomfortably revising a model they had been confident in. The model was this: humanity was a young species, capable and interesting, possibly useful, but not yet tested in the ways that mattered for serious interstellar consideration. 11 years of faster-than-light travel, a handful of colonies, one representative in the conclave who had proven politically capable, but who represented a civilization that had never fought a real engagement against a space-capable adversary. The hollow reach changed that model, not because of the numbers. 11 ships against 41 was notable, but numbers alone were not what had settled into the room with that quiet. What had settled into the room was the methodology, the way a human fleet had chosen its approach, executed it, and this was the part that nobody in that chamber had a framework for, chosen what to do with the moment after the shooting stopped. A Vithara analyst had prepared the briefing. He was thorough, KL said. and clearly made uncomfortable by his own thoroughness. He had spent a considerable portion of the briefing on the terms of the cessation, not just what the terms were, but on the specific absence of punitive demands. The human fleet had asked for nothing that could be called a victory condition. They had asked for a conversation. The analyst had apparently paused at that point in his briefing and said that he did not have a historical parallel for this outcome in conclave records. Cale said the room was quiet for a very long time after that. I was not there to see it. I was 300 light-years away, sitting in the damaged bridge of the Endurance, while my crew ran diagnostics and repair assessments, drinking something warm from a container that had partially melted in the 9th rail strike, and now had a slightly altered taste that was not unpleasant. Pharaoh came and sat next to me when the immediate work was stable. He did not say anything for a few minutes. Then he asked me, genuinely curious why I had written the cessation response the way I had. He said it was effective. Clearly, the result spoke for itself, but he wanted to understand the reasoning, because the version he would have written would have looked quite different. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Cale's first day in the chamber, about the absent chair, about Seth and her 12 years of tabled petitions. I thought about the history I had grown up with, the history that every human being grows up with, whether they engage with it carefully or not, all the centuries of exactly this kind of moment. A military engagement that ends, and then the question of what you build in the silence after. We had done it wrong so many times. So many times the wrong thing had seemed obvious and reasonable, and we had done it anyway, and we had lived with the results for generations. I said to Pharaoh, because every conflict ends eventually, every single one, and the way you treat someone in the first conversation after the shooting stops determines what kind of thing you built when you look back at it 20 years later. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, that is a very long view to take when you're sitting in a ship with a hole in the starboard array. I said, the hole will get fixed. The conversation is the permanent thing. He nodded slowly. Then he went back to his station, and I sat with my slightly melted container and watched the asteroid belt drift outside the viewport. Those huge ancient rocks moving in their slow, unconcerned paths through space that had been here long before any of us, and would be here long after. The colony was safe. The Drachnori were withdrawing. 11 ships had held a field against 41 without destroying a single vessel on either side. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and careful, and aware that the conversation I had asked for had not yet happened, and would be difficult and might not go well. But we were still there. The colony was still there, and the other side had agreed to talk. That was enough to work with. That, I had learned, was always enough to work with. Seveth arrived at my door at the 3rd hour of the station's night cycle. I had been awake. I am almost always awake at the 3rd hour, which is something my body settled into during those first months on the station, and has never fully corrected. I opened the door and found a veteran I did not recognize, small even by veteran standards, wearing the plain gray uniform of the administrative staff rather than the formal attire of a delegation member. He was holding a flat data packet in both hands, pressed against his chest, and his expression was one I had seen on human faces before. The expression of someone who has made a decision they cannot take back and has just arrived at the moment where that fact becomes real. I stepped back and let him in. His name was Seveth, and he was a data archivist, not a diplomat, not an intelligence officer, not anyone who would normally have access to what he had just brought me. He had worked in the Vithara delegation's record division for 23 years, managing the historical archive that the Vithara kept, as most dominant powers do, of everything they considered relevant to maintaining their position. He had access to that archive because someone had to manage it, and because administrative staff who have been in a position for 2 decades tend to become invisible to the people they work for. He had been invisible. He had also been reading. He set the data packet on my small table and stepped back from it, as if creating physical distance from the thing he had carried. He said that he needed me to understand something before I opened it. He was not bringing this to me because of any particular feeling about humanity. He did not know us. He had watched Cale Morrow in the chamber for 2 years and had formed some impressions, but he was not acting out of admiration or alliance. He was acting because he had spent 23 years archiving a record that he could not stop thinking about, and because the arrival of a new species in the conclave had introduced a variable that made the record suddenly feel urgent in a way it had not before. I asked him what was in the packet, he said. The protocol of continued dominance. I had never heard that phrase. He could see that I had not, and something in his posture acknowledged it, a kind of deep, tired confirmation that the thing had remained as hidden as it was designed to remain. He left 30 minutes later without the packet. I sat at my table until the station's morning cycle began, reading. The protocol of continued dominance was not a single document. It was a framework, developed approximately 300 years ago by a Vethara Strategic Council, whose names were recorded in the archive. A framework for the management of what the document called developmental trajectories within the conclave sphere. Developmental trajectories meant civilizations that were advancing technologically and socially at rates that the Vethatharva's modeling systems identified as potentially destabilizing to the existing power balance within a 3 to 5 century window. The framework had 4 stages. The first was monitoring. The second was economic interference, meaning the kind of structural commercial pressure that would slow a developing civilization's resource base without triggering the kind of visible confrontation that attracted attention. The third was what the document called facilitated decline, meaning the covert support of internal political divisions, resource scarcity, or external conflicts that would consume a civilization's energy and slow its development. The fourth stage, applicable when the first 3 had failed to produce the desired result within a defined time frame, was described in the document with clinical brevity as terminal resolution. Terminal resolution meant extinction. I am going to sit with that word for a moment because it deserves to be sat with. I had been in this galaxy's political body for 2 years by this point. I had navigated sanctions votes and diplomatic trade-offs, and the long, careful work of building relationships across fractured alliances. I had read about the history of the conclave, the wars and treaties, and slow accretions of power that had produced the institution I was sitting in every day. I understood, in an abstract intellectual sense, that a civilization does not maintain dominance for 300 years through goodwill alone. But reading the word terminal in a document that treated the end of a civilization the way a logistics report treats the retirement of an outdated equipment line, that was different. That landed in a different place. The archive listed 17 civilizations by name, 17 civilizations that had been identified by the protocol's monitoring criteria over the past 3 centuries as meeting the threshold for active management. The document noted, for 10 of the 17, that the process had been completed successfully. For 3, it noted that the process had reached stage 2 or 3 before the civilization had declined on its own, removing the need for further action. For 2, the process was described as ongoing. For 2, there were no notes at all, just names and a date of entry into the monitoring criteria, and then nothing. Absence where a record should have been. Humanity's name had been entered into the monitoring criteria 14 months ago, 2 months after I had taken my seat in the conclave chamber. We were at stage 1. I called a meeting with 6 delegation representatives that afternoon. Not the full group I had been working with, not yet. The full group needed the full presentation, and the full presentation needed to be assembled carefully, because a claim of this magnitude without rigorous documentation would be dismissed as fabrication, which would be the most convenient possible response for the Vethara and their allies. I called the 6 people I trusted most in the conclave body, which after 2 years was a small but real number, and I told them, without the documents, what Seveth had brought me. The first response was silence. The second was a question about provenance. Where had this come from? How was the source protected? How confident was I in the authenticity? I walked through the authentication checks I had been able to run overnight. The metadata consistency, the archival cross-references that matched known events, the 3 specific details that I had been able to verify independently against records that had no connection to the Vethra archive. The confidence level was high, not absolute. You never get absolute from a single source, and I said so clearly, but high. The third response, from a delegate named Oren, whose civilization I had come to respect deeply for its care with language, was the one that mattered most. Oren said, "Is my civilization in the record?" The room went very quiet. I said yes. His civilization's name appeared at entry 17. The record noted that the process had reached stage 2 before natural economic contractions had produced the desired developmental slowdown, removing the need for further action. Oren was quiet for a long time. Then he said that his people had experienced a period of severe economic difficulty approximately 90 years ago, one that historians had attributed to a combination of internal policy failures and an unusual run of poor harvests. He said that his people had studied that period in detail because it had been so costly, and because understanding it had seemed important for preventing a recurrence. He said that in 90 years of study, nobody had found the external component. He said, "We thought we had failed ourselves." I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that was adequate. The formal presentation to the conclave chamber happened 4 days later. I presented it myself, with Oren standing beside me, because he had insisted and because his presence transformed the presentation from an accusation into a testimony. I walked through the archive methodically. I presented the documentation in the order it was most legible, building the picture piece by piece, not rushing toward the conclusion, but letting the conclusion be unavoidable by the time I reached it. The chamber was the most still I had ever experienced it. When I finished, the Vithara Archdelegate Vorath requested the floor. He was granted it. He stood and spoke for 11 minutes, and I will say, with full honesty, that it was one of the most impressive speeches I have heard in my years of diplomatic work. He did not deny the document's existence. He did not claim fabrication. He did not engage in any of the evasions I had prepared responses to. Instead, he made a case. He said that the conclave existed because cooperation between spacefaring civilizations was preferable to the alternative, and that cooperation at scale requires stability, and that stability requires a dominant organizing force, and that the Vithara had been that force for 300 years, and that 300 years of relative peace in this region of the galaxy was not an accident. He said that the protocol was not a product of cruelty. It was a product of the understanding that unchecked developmental races between civilizations with weapons of the scale available to interstellar species did not end well, and that the historical record supported this, and that the conclave's founders had known this, and that the peaceful centuries since had been purchased at a cost that had never been made explicit, because making it explicit would have made it impossible to bear. He said, "Every empire does this. We have simply been doing it honestly, to ourselves, for longer than most." He said that humanity was not being managed because the Vithara disliked us. We were being managed because we had arrived at the most dangerous moment in any civilization's development. The period between achieving interstellar capability and achieving the wisdom to use it without destroying the equilibrium that every civilization in this chamber depended on. He said that the protocol existed to protect that equilibrium, and that the Vithara were prepared to defend it. The chamber was absolutely still when he sat down. I had my response prepared. I had been writing it in my head for 4 days, and had 3 alternate versions depending on what he said. The version he had given me was the one I had considered most likely, and it was also the one I had the clearest answer for, because it was the version that was hardest to answer emotionally and easiest to answer structurally. I stood up and I said, "The Archdelegate has made the case for his position with exceptional clarity, and I want to honor that by being equally clear. He is not wrong that stability has value. He is not wrong that unchecked developmental races have historically ended badly. He is not wrong that a dominant organizing force can produce conditions that are preferable to chaos." I paused. He is wrong about one thing. He is wrong about the cost. I turned to address the full chamber rather than Vorath specifically. The Archdelegate framed the protocol's cost as something that could not be spoken aloud because speaking it would make it impossible to bear. I want to test that framing. 10 civilizations by this record reached what the protocol calls terminal resolution. 10 peoples. I do not know how many individual lives that represents. The archive did not record that number, which I think tells us something. But I know that the Ravani had a name. They had the absent chair in this chamber, which has sat empty for 800 years in their honor. Because even the conclave, even this body understood that a civilization that goes silent deserves to be remembered. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the environmental systems. The Ravani are in this archive. They are entry number 3. The notation reads, "Process completed successfully." I let that sit for 10 seconds. I had counted them out in rehearsal, and I counted them now. Delegate Oran's civilization spent 90 years studying an economic catastrophe that they believed they had caused themselves. 90 years of scholars and historians and economists working to understand what they had done wrong, so they could avoid doing it again. The answer to their question was in this archive, labeled as a successful outcome, and nobody told them. I looked at Vorath directly then. The cost of this system is not just the civilizations that ended. The cost is also the ones that survived it and never knew what had been done to them. The cost is 90 years of a people's intellectual energy spent searching for a failure that was not theirs. The cost is what you believe about yourself when you think you failed, and the cost is what you never become because you spent a century recovering from a wound that was given to you on purpose. I sat down. The chamber did not erupt. It did not produce the dramatic wave of reaction that such a moment might produce in a human political setting. What it produced was something more like a slow fracture, the sound of an institution recognizing that something in its structure had just changed, and that the change could not be undone. The vote of censure on the Vethara was introduced by Oren. It was seconded by 6 delegations before the procedure had even formally opened for seconding, which was itself unprecedented. The vote did not happen that day. There were procedural requirements that meant it would take 2 more sessions. But the delegations that stood to second the censure motion were not the small, peripheral members that I had spent months cultivating. 3 of them were mid-tier powers that had been Vithara-aligned for decades. One of them had been at stage 3 of the protocol 14 years ago, and had survived because of what the archive clinically described as self-resolving instability. Vorath watched all of this from his seat. He did not respond to the seconding of the motion. He did not make any visible reaction at all, which I had come to understand was itself a form of response in Vetheran communication. The absolute control of expression under conditions of significant pressure. After the session ended, as the chamber was emptying, he walked across the floor to where I was gathering my documents. He stopped an appropriate distance away and stood until I looked up. He said, "You have made enemies that will outlast your career." I said, "I know." He said, "You have also changed something that cannot be changed back," I said. That was the intention. He looked at me for a long moment. He was old, by any measure. Old in the way that beings get when they have spent decades in positions of genuine power, carrying the weight of decisions that most people will never have to make. I did not hate him. That is important to say. I did not hate him, and I do not think he was a simple villain. And I think the speech he had given was the most honest thing anyone in that chamber had said in a very long time. But honesty is not the same as rightness. He turned and walked toward the exit. He stopped once without turning back and said, "Your people have been in space for 17 years, I said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me in 300 what you decided to do when you had this much power." He left. I stood in the chamber for a while after it emptied. The absent chair was across the floor from me, and I looked at it for a long time, thinking about the Ravani, about a people who had sat in this room and had their name written into a document as a successful outcome. I thought about the 10 others. I thought about what Vorath had said. Ask me in 300 years. He was not entirely wrong to ask that. He was not entirely wrong to imply that power held long enough begins to look like all the power that came before it, regardless of how it started. That was the most uncomfortable thing about the speech he had given, not the parts that were defensible, but the parts that were genuinely true. I walked out of the chamber and down the corridor toward my quarters, thinking about what it would mean to hold power for 300 years, thinking about whether humanity, with our 10,000 years of exactly that kind of experience on our own planet, had learned enough to do it differently, thinking that we had better. The vote was today. I had not slept well in the week leading up to it, which was unusual for me. I had long since developed the ability to sleep in difficult conditions on this station, a survival skill for any diplomat posted far from home. But this week had been different. This week, the thing we had been building for 2 years was going to either hold or break, and there is a particular quality of tension in that kind of waiting that does not respond to routine. The Galactic Compact of Ascension had gone through 3 full drafts, 2 joint revision sessions, and 1 near collapse that had required 48 hours of continuous negotiation to repair. The compact was, at its core, a simple idea that the conclave would formally commit to a policy of non-interference in the developmental trajectories of emerging species, that the covert management of civilizational development was incompatible with membership in the body, and that any member civilization identified as engaging in such practices would face a structured accountability process with real consequences. Simple idea, extraordinarily difficult document. The difficulty was not primarily with the Vethara, which might have been expected. The Vethara had been in a complicated position since the protocol's exposure. Vorath was still in his seat. The censure vote had passed, but it was a formal censure, not a removal, because removal required a 2/3 majority, and we had not reached that threshold. What the censure had done was change the internal politics of the Vethara bloc significantly. 3 of their most reliable allied delegations had quietly repositioned themselves over the preceding months. Not dramatically, not with any public statement, but in the steady accumulated evidence of votes and procedural decisions, and who sat with whom at working meals. The difficulty was with the middle. The middle of the conclave was a large and complicated place, full of civilizations that had survived for centuries by being careful about which side of any major division they were visible on. The compact asked them to be visible on this one. It asked them to take a formal position in favor of a principle that had immediate practical implications for the most powerful member of this body, and to do that in a way that would be on record permanently. There is nothing more difficult to ask of a careful diplomat than to be on record. I had spent the final 2 weeks doing what I had done in the first 6 months of my posting, but with 2 years of relationships behind me now. I met with delegations. I listened more than I spoke. I tried to understand what each specific concern was, because every concern was specific if you were willing to sit with it long enough. And specific concerns have specific answers in ways that general fears do not. The primary concern in the middle was not about the principle. Most delegations, when the conversation was genuinely private and trust had been established, were not arguing that what the Vethara had done was acceptable. The concern was about what came after. The concern was about a galaxy in which the Vethara's dominance had been structurally diminished, and whether the thing that replaced it would be better or different, or simply new. The concern, underneath all the careful diplomatic language, was whether humanity was the beginning of an answer, or just the beginning of another kind of problem. I understood that concern. I had sat with it myself many times, in my small room with the 2-short bed, in the long hours after the 3rd hour of the station's night cycle. The answer I gave was not reassurance. Reassurance is what you offer when you do not have a real answer. The answer I gave was structural. The compact did not empower humanity. The compact empowered the mechanism. It created a formal process with defined membership, rotating oversight responsibilities, transparent reporting, and an appeals framework that did not run through any single civilization's approval. If humanity ever did what the Vethara had done, and I said this explicitly, in every meeting, without hedging, the compact would apply to us exactly as it applied to everyone else. Some delegations found this convincing on its own. Others needed more. For those, I brought something I had been holding back deliberately, an argument that I had not used in any of the early negotiations, because it was too large for the tactical moments, but that fit the final week. I said, the Vethara's argument for the protocol was that unchecked developmental races between civilizations with interstellar weapons capability ended in catastrophe. That argument was not without merit. The question was not whether you needed a mechanism to manage that risk. The question was whether the mechanism should be hidden, unilateral, and fatal, or visible, collective, and constructive. Then I said something that I had been thinking about since Vorath walked out of the chamber the night of the protocol exposure. I said that Earth had approximately 10,000 years of experience trying to figure out what to do with powerful civilizations that felt threatened by other powerful civilizations, and that the historical record contained a great many approaches. Some of those approaches had been precisely what the Vethara had done: manage the threat, suppress the competition, maintain the hierarchy. I knew that history. I had studied it carefully. I had studied what those approaches produced over the long run, not just for the civilizations that were managed, but for the civilizations that did the managing. It does not end well for either of them. The alternatives, and there were alternatives, documented alternatives, things that human history had actually tried and that had actually worked, not perfectly, not forever, but better and longer, and with more resilience, were built on a different premise, not trust, not naivety, but a structural recognition that a galaxy in which every emerging civilization was a potential threat to the dominant order was a galaxy in permanent, exhausting defensive crouch, and that the energy spent suppressing development could be spent on something else, could be spent on the problems that no single civilization, however dominant, had managed to solve alone. On the morning of the vote, I arrived at the chamber early. I had done this on important days since my first session. Arriving early meant walking in while the room was still filling, which meant observing who sat where, who spoke to whom in the minutes before formality took over, who avoided whose eyes. What I saw that morning was different from anything I had seen before. The normal patterns of the chamber, the clusters of aligned delegations, the physical expressions of political geography were disrupted. Delegations that never sat near each other were in conversation. The middle section of the chamber, which historically arranged itself in rough proximity to whichever side of a major debate seemed likely to prevail, was not arranged that way. There was a scatteredness to the room that I had never seen, and it took me a moment to understand what it was. It was individual decision. Each delegate in that room had made their decision themselves, based on their own calculation, and the result was a room full of people who had not compared notes in the usual way, because the usual way required you to know which direction the wind was blowing before you committed. And this morning nobody knew. I sat in my seat. After 2 years it was simply my seat, though the administrative record still listed it as the absent chair, and there was a quiet, ongoing procedural dispute about whether my occupancy of it constituted a formal claim of membership on Earth's behalf or something more ambiguous. I had not pressed that dispute. Ambiguity had served us well. The dispute itself had kept 3 lawyers across 4 delegations occupied for the better part of a year, which had its own value. Vorath arrived and took his seat without looking at me. He had not spoken to me since the night of the chamber confrontation, and I had not sought him out. The censor had changed his position in ways that were still working themselves out through the Vithara's internal politics, and I had learned enough about Vithara culture to know that the working out of those things was not a process that welcomed outside observation. The session opened. The procedural reading of the compact's final text took 18 minutes. Because the full document was substantial and the reading was formal, I sat through it and listened to the words I had spent months on, and there was a strange quality to hearing them read aloud in the chamber's formal register. They sounded simultaneously like exactly what I had intended and like something larger than what I had intended, which is perhaps what happens when language finally reaches the moment it was written for. The vote opened. In the conclave, major votes do not happen all at once. Each delegation submits in a defined sequence, partly for procedural reasons, and partly because the sequence itself carries information. Who votes early, who waits, who changes a submitted position in the final minutes of the window. I had studied the sequence carefully. I knew who was likely to vote early in favor, which would create a signal that other delegations would read and respond to. The first vote in favor came from Oren's delegation, which was expected. The second from a civilization called the Perret, which was also expected. The third was from a delegation I had assessed as likely to abstain, and something in my chest moved when their tally appeared. The votes came in over 40 minutes. I watched the tally display without expression, which took considerably more effort than I am generally willing to admit. With 9 minutes remaining in the voting window, the count stood at 22 in favor, 19 against, 4 abstentions, and 2 delegations had not yet submitted. A simple majority required 24 votes. We were too short. One of the 2 remaining delegations was a mid-tier civilization called the Harathi, who I had spoken with 6 times over the preceding months, and who had told me most recently, 3 days ago, that they were still considering their position. The other was a small delegation whose ambassador I had shared several working meals with over the past year, a being named Lura, whose civilization's name I am going to decline to record here, because their internal politics are their own business, and what they did that morning deserves to be remembered as their choice, not my influence. Lura's vote came in with 6 minutes remaining. It was in favor. 23. I breathed. 5 minutes. The Harathi had not submitted. I did not look at their delegation seat. I had learned, in 2 years, that watching people while they are deciding something does not help them decide, and does not help you wait. I looked at the tally display, and I thought about Seth, who had voted against the sanctions motion, because no one had ever asked her about her home planet. I thought about Oren, and 90 years of scholars studying a catastrophe that had been manufactured. I thought about Seveth, who had knocked on my door at the 3rd hour of the night cycle, carrying a flat data packet pressed against his chest like something that had been burning him for a long time. I thought about the Revani. Entry number 3. Process completed successfully. With 2 minutes remaining, the Harathi vote came in favor, 24, the exact threshold. The compact passed. The chamber did not erupt. The conclave was still not a body that erupted. What it produced was a sound that I had not heard in 2 years in that room. The sound of 47 delegations responding to the same moment in approximately the same way at the same time. A low collective exhalation, a release of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. I sat in my seat and I let myself breathe. Vorath did not leave the chamber immediately after the session closed, which I noticed because he usually moved quickly. I was gathering my things when he appeared at the edge of the central floor, not approaching, just standing. I looked at him. He said, "You have made this galaxy more dangerous," I said. "No, we made it more honest. The danger was always there. You just used to own it." He considered that for a moment. He said, "You are very certain that your species will hold to what you have built here?" I said, "No, I am not certain at all. I am hopeful, which is a different thing, and I think a more honest thing." He said, "Hopefulness is a luxury of species that have not yet had to make the decisions that produce records like the one your operative found in our archive." I said, "I know. I am also aware that hopefulness is not the same as naivety, and that the compact is not built on hope. It is built on structure. The structure exists so that when the hope runs out, and it will, in individuals if not in civilizations, it always does, the mechanism remains." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected him to say. He said, "Your predecessor in that seat, the Ravani, they were not eliminated because they were powerful. They were eliminated because they were asking questions that the framework had no good answers to, and the framework responded to the questions by ending the ones who asked them." I had not known that. It was not in the archive. I asked him what questions. He said, "The same ones you have been asking for 2 years." He left. I stood in the empty chamber for a long time after that. The lights had shifted to the station's post-session setting, lower and warmer, and the room had a different quality without the delegations in it. Enormous and still, and full of something I can only describe as weight. The weight of everything that had been said in this room over 3 centuries. The weight of everything that had not been said. The weight of the empty chair, which was no longer empty, and of the 10 names in an archive that would now be part of the conclave's public record, and of the 2 names with no notation at all, whose stories were still being looked for. We had not fixed anything. I want to be clear about that, because I think the temptation after a vote like this one is to feel like something has been completed, and the truth is that almost nothing had been completed. The compact existed on paper and in the record, and it would be tested by the next civilization that reached the developmental threshold that the protocol had been designed to manage, and we would see then whether the structure held or whether it bent, and if it bent, whether it could be repaired, and if it could not, what we would do instead. That work had not started. That work was most of the work, but we had a seat. We had the compact. We had a record that was now visible, and a framework that was now accountable. And 37 years from today, if the conclave's procedural calendar holds, and no emergency session supersedes the scheduled review, the compact would come up for mandatory reassessment, and whoever sat in this chair at that point would have to make the argument again, with 2 years' worth of evidence, this time instead of 2 years' worth of hope. I walked to the viewport at the end of the chamber corridor, the one that looked out over the longest unobstructed view from the station. Outside, a new ship was docking, a delegation arriving for a follow-on session on a trade corridor matter that seemed, in the context of this day, somewhat manageable. The stars beyond the ship were the same stars I had looked at from my small room during the 3rd-hour sleeplessness, the same stars that looked back at every intelligent species that had ever developed enough to look up. A Vethara staff member I had seen many times over 2 years, but never spoken to passed me in the corridor, paused, and said something brief in the trade language. My comprehension was at full fluency now, 2 years in, and I understood it immediately. He said, "Congratulations on the vote." I said, "Thank you." He walked on. I stood at the viewport a while longer. We did not come to the stars because we were ready. We came because we could not stop. Curiosity and stubbornness and the particular human inability to look at a closed door and accept that it is meant to stay closed had carried us across the distance that should have taken another century. And we had walked into a room that was not expecting us, and sat in a chair that was not ours and stayed until it was. We brought with us everything we were. The scar tissue of 10,000 years of making mistakes and sometimes learning from them. The hard, slow, incomplete knowledge of what power does over time, and what it costs, and what it produces if you are not careful about the structure you build around it. The irrational, unkillable conviction. Not knowledge, not certainty. Just conviction. That things could be different if you chose differently than the last person who had stood in this place. The galaxy had not seen that before. It had seen capable species and powerful species and ancient species and species with weapons that could reshape the surface of a planet. It had seen ambition and strategy, and the long, patient accumulation of influence that produces empires. It had seen all of the things that come with the territory of civilizations that have been here long enough to settle into their nature. It had not seen a species that showed up before anyone asked, sat in the chair of a people it had never met, and spent 2 years asking what those people had wanted to know before they went silent. I did not know if we would do what Varath had asked, hold to what we had built, across the centuries and the pressures and the inevitable moments when the short view and the long view would pull in opposite directions. I did not know if humanity would prove, in 300 years, to be different from the powers that had come before us, or whether Vorath's question would be answered in an archive that some future diplomat found at the third hour of a sleepless night. But I knew what the Ravani had asked, and I knew that asking was worth the cost of asking. I turned from the viewport and walked toward my office. There was a message from Commander Yara Osi waiting, marked routine, sent from the Hollow Reach sector, where the ongoing talks with the Draknori had entered their 7th month and were, according to the latest update, making progress. There was a message from the Prime Council, marked priority, asking for an initial assessment of the compact's passing and what it meant for Earth's next year of diplomatic strategy. There was a message from Orin, marked personal, which I would read last, when I was alone and had the time to read it carefully. There was also a message from a civilization I had never heard of, from a system I did not recognize, addressed to the human delegation of the Galactic Conclave, marked simply, "We have been listening. We would like to speak." I sat down at my desk. I started reading.